Welcome, and thanks for all of you who've gathered with us today. My name is Liat Margolis, and I have the privilege of serving as the Associate Dean of Research for the Daniels Faculty and the Director of the MLA program. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's talk entitled Revisiting the Commons by Kofi Boone. To open this very special event today, I'd like to take a moment and give gratitude to the land where we're each located. I'd like us to remember that the University of Toronto is located on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wyandot nations. The City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa nations. Pre-contact, the territory was the subject of the Dishwood One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. These principles of respectful partnerships and environmental conservation are core aspirations of the Landscape program, and we're honored to have the opportunity to walk side by side with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and respond to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. I'd like to invite my co-host and dear colleague, Professor Fadi Masoud, to introduce our special guest.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Liat. My name is Fadi Masoud. I'm an assistant professor of landscape architecture and urbanism and the director of the Center for Landscape Research here at the Daniels Faculty. It is my honor and privilege to welcome Kofi to the Daniels Faculty today. Kofi Boone is the Joseph D. Moore Distinguished Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning and University Faculty Scholar at NC State University College of Design. Kofi is a Detroit native, so just down the 401 from here, and his work is in the overlap between landscape architecture and environmental justice with specializations in democratic design, digital media, and interpreting cultural landscapes. His voice is seminal in bridging the conversation between issues of climate and social justice, landscape architecture, and the design and transformation of the public realm. Kofi, your talk couldn't be timelier to many of the questions our students, our faculty are grappling with, especially within our core third semester integrated urbanism studio, which asks all our graduate architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture students to grapple with issues of housing, public realm, climate justice, and environmental issues in the design of the city. So thank you so much for making the time for us today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Fadi. Thank you, everyone. It's a great honor to be here with you today. I've had the privilege of seeing some of the work from your department, from your school, and it's top-notch, both in final thesis reviews, which I had a chance to see last year, as well as the Green New Deal Super Studios. So my hat's off to all of you. And as they mentioned, I am a Detroit native and enjoyed many times and trips to Toronto. So thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now. And hopefully everyone can see. So this topic, Revisiting the Commons, Land, Property Information, and Landscape Agency, is a topic that I've been thinking about in the past few years, most specifically in work with my colleague, Julian Edgemon at Tufts University. And we hope that this topic opens up some interesting food for thought and some questions as we move forward, particularly after 2020. We'll begin with some acknowledgements, and I greatly admire the land acknowledgements that you all have prepared. This one won't be as thorough, but I will say that I am coming to you from the land of the Ino and the Saponi, the Lumbee, the Cherokee, and many other First Nations, and we ask permission to share these words with you from that land. But I'm also coming to you from the southeastern United States. And it is interesting that up until recently, we never really talked about another legacy that leaves a very strong imprint on our land, which is the legacy of slavery and the enslavement of African people. And this map is very important to us, the white dot indicating where I am in the triangle of North Carolina. It is a map of enslaved population, the census in 1860, which by county indicated the percent of enslaved African people. And the darker the color, the higher the percentage. What's interesting about this map as well is it's a geological map where it indicates where the soils were that led to the large plantations, which drove that massive injustice. So in our case, we're coming to the place of reckoning and understanding the lasting legacy of both the disenfranchisement and dislocation and destruction of indigenous and native populations, but also a government and a country and a nation and an economy that was born from free labor on stolen land. So those are components that influence everything that at least I think about these days in terms of our relevance and our connection to the South. And of course, we're coming to the 200th birthday of Frederick Olmsted, who popularized landscape architecture in our country. And in fact, before a lot of his great works, was an abolitionist, did write extensively about his times in the South and moving through plantations, but as indicated by some of his work, echoed this notion of othering and dealing with others in different ways and dislocating and dispossessing people through the act of landscape architecture. It's a legacy that we're all reckoning with now. So this is an image of Central Park in New York, which in many cases popularized the idea of the public park in American cities and American growth in the late 19th century. But in fact, prior to Central Park's development, there were self-built communities in the footprint of Central Park, one of which was Seneca Village, a self-built community by African Americans, population approximating 800 to 900 people, which not only was erased in the footprint of Central Park, but Frederick Olmsted did not allow Black people to even work on his projects, to implement or build or construct his places. So not only the loss of that property and that land, but the lack of participation, even in the economic benefit of what that afforded. And I love the Sheep's Meadow, which is the image on the right. I've been there myself many times. It's inspirational, but it does indicate that even in our DNA, the early stages of our profession, at least in the United States, we faced this dilemma of the value of the things that we make, who benefits, who participates, and at what cost. And so that's something that has been extended through other researchers. This chart from Mindy Thompson Fullilove, who wrote an incredible book called Root Shock, which talks about the psychological and psychiatric impacts of people losing their home place, where she focuses on several case studies, the South Bronx of New York, the Hill District of Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, and talks about in a series of intentional moves ranging from Jim Crow and redlining to now the conversations we have about gentrification and displacement, the loss of people's connection to their land, to their home places, and how that's led to generational trauma. So this idea of serial displacement is important. And at least in our country, the inability to stay in place, to invest in place, has real material consequences. This chart shows the difference in wealth between white, Black, and Latino households in our country. This was done in the early 2010s. Those numbers haven't changed. So we're forecasted in terms of Black and Brown communities in our country to have 100 times less wealth than white communities, largely dependent on land value. The biggest determinant of median wealth in households in the United States is home ownership and equity built from those homes. And there are incredible policies that have disinvested in Black and Brown communities, disrupted their ability to acquire wealth, that have not impacted white households. And so we're dealing with generational trauma and generational challenges and strategies. And in some cases, this came to the fore last summer. So the twin pandemics, this of course from Landscape Architecture magazine, one pandemic we know well, we're still in the grips of and trying to survive of COVID-19. The other, the reaction to the murder of George Floyd and the groundswell of insurrection that not only affected our country, but all over the world. And really the idea of how do we reckon with that? In some cases, we reckoned with it in fun ways, right? The idea that we were socially isolated, we were constantly on screen and trying to find ways to build community, even in this digital world. So Club Quarantine and D-Nice and a number of others brought people together in unprecedented ways, taking advantage of some of the benefits of where we are now. In some cases, it was very real and material. Systems of mutual aid emerged to help people from everything from healthcare to daycare to transportation to food security. These sort of self-organized, self-started collective ways of addressing the deficiencies and what we discovered through that stress point of COVID-19. And so that observation of what was happening at the time led Julian and I to write this article talking about collective ownership and this notion of a Black Commons. Black Commons we'll talk about in a second, proposed as a strategy to build wealth through community land trusts and cooperative land ownership, but extending that beyond, right? Not just ownership, but also information, access to technology. And maybe this is an opportunity for us to rethink wealth as well. And with regards to landscape architecture, environmental planning, which has so much to do with the land and with property, what are the implications of this way of thinking on what we do? With regards to the commons, most people are familiar with the commons because of a great critique of the commons, right? That the idea of, if you think about English settler colonialism and what happened, particularly in Boston and other places in our country, these shared resources and this fear that was put forward in the tragedy of the commons by Hardin of fear of without strong regulation and top-down governance, the exploitation and eventually the destruction of shared resources. The idea that left to their own devices, people will act in their own self-interest, they will act in the interest of collective good. You know, this thesis was pushed back against by Eleanor Ostrom, which won her a Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, where she really championed the value of local knowledge and the need for institutional adaptation. The idea that we are able to begin to build these decentralized networks that take the place of strictly top-down governance in the interest of collective action and work. And she illustrates many examples around the world of how that's happened. So there was a pushback. And so, you know, in the case of Julian and I in our writing, this comes from an article that we're working on now, we looked at this idea of commons and this expanded notion of wealth based off of Sen's capabilities approach, for which he won a Nobel Prize in 1998. This idea of thinking of social goods held in common as some form of commonwealth. The idea that we make investments to build people's capabilities through the medium that we're working in, whether it be architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, or other places. And through those investments and building those capabilities, which cycle back and continue, it's in pursuit of freedom. So, you know, a lot of my research is in this notion of the spectrum of equality to equity to justice to liberation. But this idea of pursuing freedoms as that instigator for what we have to build our capabilities, we need more investment. We need to return our capabilities back as investment to build this common pool of resources, be it land, be it information, be it skill sets in that interest. And so this is sort of a model that we've been thinking about. With regards to landscape architecture in the classroom and where a lot of you are right now, you know, my introduction to a lot of this work happened several years ago through a studio. So where we are in North Carolina, we're right on the edge of the urban and the rural divide, which still grips our country. But Henderson, North Carolina is one of the most impoverished counties in our state and is largely agrarian and agricultural based. And so we were looking at ways to sort of activate that and turn it into, you know, a benefit and a resource. We looked at it through the prism of social determinants of health. So how are ways that we can think about people and landscape associated with ways that really invest in people's capabilities, particularly their lifestyles and their health. The organization that we work with was the first time I'd actually worked with a cooperative called GROW, Green Rural Redevelopment Organization, which is an association of farmers around this particular community. And they were very interested in healthy food options for people with cardiovascular disease and chronic diseases. How do we start to put those people first in line? And so this led us to think about economics and policy, not just the physical design first. What are the other ecosystems within which these communities are operating, and how could collective work actually impact positively people in that community? So there were several opportunities ahead of us. Medicare, which pays for funds access to healthy food. So there was a revenue stream associated with it, and the opportunity zones, which have sort of carved up a lot of our cities around the country, but provided tax incentives for investment in jobs and other things within the boundary of the community. This idea of the Good Bowl, which was for people who are coming out of the hospital for treatment for cardiovascular disease, the federal government requires they have access to healthy food options, which are typically dry goods, canned goods, things that have a long shelf life and not actually fresh produce. And so our students had to do economic analysis to say, well, look, if we wanted to provide a fresh alternative, say locally grown, quote unquote, the good bowl, the idea that you could sort of create dishes that really are made of locally gathered produce from these cooperatives, what are the price points that we need to be thinking about? And therefore, what's the productivity that we need to do? So this led us to not just the political analysis there, but the economic analysis as well, in order to make these things work. And then the partnerships required, because you can't do any of it on your own. And so GROW being the main organization, the cooperative, but how can it participate with a farm school that even extends it to teaching people about the ways to cultivate the land, particularly open land in a city that has a lot of vacant land? And how does that partner with colleges and other forms of education? So this way of thinking helped us think about the value of the physical design school sets that we have in landscape architecture and planning, but how it folds into another way of thinking about it. So just broadly, 80 acres of land, including vacant land and some underutilized park spaces, could conceivably produce almost 5 million pounds of food a year if we used all of that for agriculture. And so that gave us a little bit of baseline in terms of productivity. But also in this, what we would call legacy city, where it's going through economic transition and disinvestment, large public facilities that were underutilized, disinvested parks, closed school buildings, that kind of thing. So targeting reinvestment and reuse of that infrastructure for this purpose became something that became important. Directly engaging the people that we're dealing with. So here is artist Cruz from the Cruz Farm and Cruz family showing, the current strategies that communities are doing. At High House, that's on the left, that's our students learning about growing tomatoes in a controlled environment that's actually in a vacant lot in that particular community. And then at Exchange, so on the right, our students showing how knowledge of how that thing works on site could lead to design and planning strategies and engaging them as co-creators along the way. Communicating the benefit of regenerating soils and the medium within which we need to grow food. And so talking about root zones and ecosystem health and a lot of the other things that aren't really directly centered around even small-scale agriculture, but are vital to the broader health of the community. Translating programmatic elements that they might consider into things that are easily understood, readily communicated, could be transmitted and disseminated between community folks, even without technical experts. And then vision plans. And so in one example, this is an older school that had been gone into disuse that GROW envisioned as a growing and meeting and food preparation and a small food hub sort of setting. And so helping them persuade policymakers that it's important. And so these images show sort of what happened at the end of that studio, where they were successful in negotiating with the town of Henderson to acquire a closed school that had an industrial scale kitchen that allowed them to scale up and meet some of the economic demands required of the Good Bowl strategy. And so that's an incredible outcome, and they're doing extremely well dealing with that right now. But that was sort of how we got our feet wet in terms of this conversation. But to bring it back to, the summer of 2020, incredible things happen, horrible things happen, and the aftermath is interesting to track, but it's important to talk about a short story about George Floyd himself. George Floyd, although murdered in Minneapolis, was a native of Houston. And Houston is important in United States history for a lot of reasons. One is nearby Galveston is where the Emancipation Proclamation was read 2 years after it occurred. So for people who aren't aware of US history, Emancipation Proclamation from President Lincoln as a way to destabilize the Confederacy, right? The Confederate States of America made all slaves free. So that free labor force that was critical to Confederate States of America, the fastest way to cripple them is to essentially outlaw slavery. So that was made in 1863, before the end of the Civil War. People in Galveston, Texas, near Houston, Texas, didn't know until 2 years later this declaration. So they were free for 2 years and had no idea. This gave birth to America's most recent holiday. Last year, they made Juneteenth, that holiday, to celebrate this particular event. Also in this community was Reverend Jack Yates. George Floyd went to Jack Yates High School, named after this gentleman. who formed the Colored People's Festival and Emancipation Park Association in 1872. He was a minister, and he built a small cohort, you see pictured here, of free Black people to invest into buying 10 acres of property in Houston for the purpose of creating a park that would be used specifically for the celebration of Juneteenth and Emancipation Day. That's an image of Emancipation Park today with Houston in the background. It was Houston's first public park. It was the largest land ownership in Houston at the time, collectively owned, and with that sole purpose. The sad part is that in recent history, the value and the reinvestment of that park instigated displacement and gentrification. That's a sad consequence of it. But for its time, the fact that a group of recently freed Black folks, first thing they decided to do was to pool their resources, buy land for a park, before there was a park system or any other parks in Houston, for the purpose of continuing ritual and tradition, is significant. And it's something that sort of predates some of the other things I'm getting ready to talk about there, but it illustrates its impetus that there were a lot of decisions to be made in the aftermath of the end of slavery and the end of the Civil War, but people decided to pool their resources together and invest in place. This is important because in our country, there's a history of what's called Black land loss. So approximately 98% of land that was formerly in the hands of African Americans, particularly right after Reconstruction and the end of the Civil War, has been sold or lost due to federal decisions. There have been several settlements and lawsuits with the government, most recently Pigford case, which provided billions of dollars in sort of recompense for people who had lost land. But if you added up all the land that was lost in the United States that was formerly African-American land, particularly in rural areas, you're talking about $1 trillion in land value that could have been used to schools, infrastructure, build and own homes, secure neighborhoods, but not available. So anytime that folks are investing and holding on to place, they are bucking a huge national trend for the good. For more about collective action and cooperatives, this is an excellent book that was required reading for our classes. Jessica Nemhart's Collective Courage, which talks about the history of cooperative economic thought and practice, really beginning at the end of the 19th century, moving through the early 20th century. And it's shocking how many collaboratives and cooperatives there were. One of our academic heroes here is W.B. Du Bois, who wrote extensively about cooperatives. And so coming out of Reconstruction, sort of the disappointment of what the Southerners called restoration, the elimination of all of the privileges and rights that came from Reconstruction in the late 19th century, Du Bois started to study, small markets, small farms, producer cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, all kinds of cooperatives as a way to build shared resources and shared wealth. And through his writing, he started to document it. At the time of this writing, in the early 20th century, this is from 1907, there were 9,000 such cooperatives in the Black community alone around the country, trying to find collective ways with modest means to build wealth. For a lot of people who are unfamiliar with the cooperative movement and investment in communities, their first taste of it might have been the Watchmen. So, great graphic novel comic book that I loved when I was in high school that was made into an HBO series, reimagined to move from the fear of nuclear annihilation, which was the initial impetus for the story, to the reckoning and the aftermath of slavery and incredible harm done to Black people. So here we see the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which at its time, in the early 1920s, was the wealthiest and most prosperous Black community in our entire nation, and was destroyed, leveled, bombed. It's the opening scenes of The Watchmen, as you see planes dropping bombs on this particular district due to really hostility, racism, and white supremacy. So, but was rebuilt. So what's important to know is that Black Wall Street was not its initial name. It was the Greenwood District. It was rebuilt and renamed Black Wall Street in response to that trauma, largely due to cooperative economics, people pooling their money and raising resources and building their own bridges with one another. So an incredible legacy. And where we are in North Carolina, there's a legacy here as well. So this is the Black Wall Street that was never bombed. This is in Durham, North Carolina. And Black Wall Street here is Parrish Street. It was the home of Mechanics and Farmers Bank and and a number of other enterprises that up until the 1960s employed the most African Americans in the United States in the country. So these long-standing entities of loans, of life insurance, of property ownership, and pool resources built incredible places. Shifting to land, we start to move further to the rural part of our story and the aftermath of the civil rights movement. The great Fannie Lou Hamer, who led the Mississippi Freedom Party in defiance to exclusion from the Democratic Party for labor interests and the interests of people who were sharecropping at the time, proposed this idea of Mississippi Freedom Farms and found investors to purchase large quantities of land with the express purpose of allowing people to not have to pay the taxes or pay the land costs, but really extract whatever wealth they could generate from that land, be it crops or be it animals and produce. In this case, on the right, she's standing in front of the pig bank, where very poor Mississippians could, get a pig, as soon as it had a litter, contribute that litter back for other poor Mississippians to be able to get access to the same resource. You can see that kind of played out in the Heifer Foundation, which is a global network dealing with cows and access to protein in very poor communities. But they kind of piloted this kind of idea as sort of the next step of dealing with the outcomes of the civil rights movement, which were largely legal and political, but they were shifting to economic and land control. This got intensified and codified by the Schumacher Center. So Charles Sherrod and Robert Swan in 1967 and many others encode what we know today as community land trusts, with the specific interest of weaving land ownership, essentially pulling it out of the capitalistic market of land as property for consumption, removing all of that foundation, and instead using it as an engine for people to build their own wealth and stability in that process. And it's the Schumacher Center who actually proposed this idea of the Black Commons as a way to deal with it. For people who may not be familiar with land trusts and community land trusts, the land is owned and is governed by a board, and it's never sold. And in the case of residential, it's intentionally held to promote affordable housing. And people who occupy the land, they lease for a period of time. They can take whatever revenue or wealth is generated from the land with them, but when they leave the land for the next person. And so this is a really interesting sort of model that has gone all over the world since that innovation occurred. The most famous in our country is probably the Dudley Street initiative in Boston, Massachusetts. And Mel King, who's on the right, who was the first Black man to run for mayor of Boston, who lost, but chronicled in the book Streets of Hope, talks about how the land trust moved from sort of a rural sort of context to an urban one to deal with more contemporary challenges. So it's hard for people to believe in our country because Boston is exploding like every other major urban center. But in our country in the 80s, it was not. It was struggling just like a lot of American cities were. And so in the midst of that, activists, the Neighborhood Incorporated group, managed to negotiate with the mayor to put a moratorium on all investment in this particular area and to transfer the core part of the area, sort of a triangle, to the Dudley Street Initiative, to allow them to establish a land trust model in an urban context and start to incorporate homeownership with job development and workforce development and other elements in the gap. So they kind of put an arm out to prevent it from being consumed. And so we can see generations later, the triangle's been extremely successful and has expanded to every manner of life. So greenhouses that grow local food, restaurants and startups for local companies, permanently affordable housing of different types, and resistant to the market forces that have affected the rest of the city. So lack of no gentrification or displacement within the triangle. And on the other side, more security, which is to say, in our Great Recession in 2009, when a lot of people were foreclosing on homes and losing their ability to hold on to properties, there was no foreclosures within the Dudley Street Initiative. So not only did it give a foothold for people who were trying to build their wealth and connections, it also buffered them from the negative consequences of downturns in the economy tied to real estate. And it's an old model. It's interesting that this research sort of uncovered, again, these sort of ecosystems that we don't pay as much attention to. And, Rondo and St. Paul in Minnesota, the neighbor of Minneapolis where Mr. Floyd was murdered, was one of the incredible northern cooperative communities where a lot of the wealth-built middle-class African-American community was through the models that W.B. Du Bois laid out. But in their case, they were decimated and destroyed by freeway construction. And so a lot has been written, at least in our country, about the factors determining urban renewal strategies and where freeways were put forward in the mid 20th century. And in many ways, it was race, right? So the idea that Black and brown communities were not as valuable as others. So they were identified as slums and destroyed. And so this happened in the case of Rondo as well. What's interesting in the contemporary sense is they recovered a lot of that history, in the past few years. They identified and documented the businesses that were lost due to that construction. They moved into incremental stages of trying to create spaces to help to tell that narrative and to build political and economic capacity to encourage reinvestment in this particular community. This is a gallery and a small museum that's in the middle of the neighborhood that starts to describe that story. And their bigger plan is essentially removing the freeway, and if they can't, capping it, actually putting a park on top of it and rebuilding the main street that was lost, literally on the freeway. So these designs and these plans are several years old, but of course, in our country, we just passed a huge infrastructure bill, about $1.8 trillion. And part of that is earmarked for repairing the harm done by freeways in the mid 20th century. So Rondo may become one of those examples of the damage done, collective action, and it is a land trust as well, which means that that land that would be available for business owners and residents in the new Main Street environment will be collectively owned. It may become one of these first examples of how people have attempted to heal these particular wounds. This study helped us to understand that we were operating in a different ecosystem, and this map is incomplete, but we assigned cooperatives and community land trusts to a lot of our students, and now we've gathered about 48 to 50 examples, and I will share a link to this map with you all so you can take a look at it. But be curious to see if there is a Canadian equivalent to this, or if there are lessons learned that you can benefit from that come from our region and our country. Because as you can see, the southeast of our country is very well represented in terms of cooperatives and community land trusts as strategies for collective action. We started earlier in the talk with the digital side. So part of it was humorous, although I enjoyed the club quarantine viewing parties and the versus battles. That's all important to building community. But some of us have taken another step in the digital realm to talk about how to build collective work and collective action using the tools that we're all experiencing today. So that's Justin Garrett Moore, who's currently at the Mellon Foundation. He's a native of Indianapolis, Indiana, and where he's standing is in his community's, his family's historic land. And Indianapolis, like a lot of other cities, is dealing with, the forces of disinvestment and reinvestment. And so sort of intervening to figure out ways to leverage, collective value and wealth in that requirement. And really took the Etsy model and applied it to urban design, which I found really interesting. So Urban Patch is sort of an a la carte sort of Kickstarter for urban design strategies, planting trees, making greenways and trails and walkways, signage, investment in businesses, wildly successful. So this idea of many people who have never even been to Indianapolis or even know anything about that particular community, investing and helping them move forward through the collective tools that we have online is a major thing. And this is one of the outcomes, was a bodega. So for the first time in a generation, a locally owned grocery store next to an urban farm where the produce that's sold in that grocery store is made, was all done decentralized through this funding model. And so the implications of the collective, not just being place-based and physical, but interest and attitude-based is important as well. Urban Patch has since grown up And this is affordable housing that they're building in Rwanda through the exact same model. And not only are they producing something of quality from a design perspective, they are seeding the resources required to build training programs and educational opportunities for people in Rwanda to gain these skills. So after the cooperative is not just about the investment, the cooperative is about access to information and technology for people to self-replicate. Not unlike the MASS design model, if you're familiar with MASS, similar sort of thing in the same region. So revisiting this, there are a lot of directions that this has gone, and we focused on a few different elements. Another direction it's gone is how we think about our roles as design professionals, as educators, as students, as future practitioners. Of course, Brian Lee's great work, Designers Protest, which really went into high gear during the COVID epidemic in 2020, the aftermath of George Floyd, which used that moment to really get us to critique and confront some of the conventions we have and how we practice design, and using a lot of these civil rights tactics, but to design for collective action, particularly against the carceral state. And a lot of the things that we do, how we think about CEPTED, crime prevention through environmental design. It's an acronym for our country, but how much of that is embedded with inherent bias and racist policies, and how this becomes a moment for us to really rethink that through collective action. Dark Matter University, which has taken that same idea, but started to apply it to the academy and say that just because I'm at NC State and you all are at Daniels and we're all at different universities, maybe we shouldn't be so siloed. Or a lot of our culture is designed to make us compete with one another in a lot of ways. When in fact, maybe we don't. Maybe we reorganize around interests, and maybe we create more access and make our boundaries more porous. And share information and experiences in different ways. And so an incredible amount of work done by the participants in Dark Matter University. And something I had the pleasure of participating in the past year, the ABC Collectives, Architecture Beyond Capitalism, an alternative way of disseminating information that really brings into question how we actually practice what we do. A lot of what we do is fee for service and client-based, which runs counter in some cases to the idea of collective. How our offices are organized is often very hierarchical and not collective. So this was a series of conversations, largely led by architects, but with other disciplines, about how we can apply a collective mindset internally, not just recognizing places that were built through collectives or using collective practices, but changing our professional ethics to embody collective work. And there were several examples that were there. So the Open Architecture Collaborative, which has a horizontal flat structure for decision-making. It has unique relationships with the clients and communities they serve, is one example. And another, La Col in Barcelona, which benefited from, in the Catalan region of Spain, a mandate at the policy scale, sort of carving out space for collective practices along with traditional, more capitalist fee-for-service practices. So actually policy changes enabling a new way of firm organization that allows more collaborative and more collective work. So globally and locally, there's a trend of thinking that way. With that, I'd like to stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kofi. Just like to invite everybody to submit your questions through the Q&A. There's already a couple of questions here. I missed the name of the organization working on the Good Bowl project, who were looking at the economies, health, accessibility, food, agriculture. What was their name or acronym?
Okay, the acronym was GROW, G-R-R-O, and the organization's name is Green Rural Redevelopment Organization. I'll put it in the chat. Happy to do it.
Yeah, and thank you for offering to share the database of the collectives that you've begun with your students. It sounds like an amazing thing for us to take up and look at what's happening on the Canadian side and contribute to this kind of knowledge and exchange. And I have a comment here, reminds me a lot about Nova Scotia's Black settlements and the Black settlements in downtown Toronto behind City Hall. So maybe there's some clues here for us to look into already. Are you familiar with that, Kofi?
I'm not. And now I have a colleague who's worked in Vancouver. So Zena Howard, who's a design principal at a firm called Perkins and Will, has been working with, I guess, a community where they started a freeway project and stopped it in the middle of Vancouver, but it kind of followed the American pattern of really targeted decisions about locating those facilities in Black communities that were considered slums. So I'm familiar on the sort of the western side of Canada, but not the eastern side at all. That would be great to learn more. Yes, Hogan's Alley. Someone put it in. Yes, Hogan's Alley. But I would love to learn more about that.
Maybe.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can. There's another common question here, but I have one of my own, if that's okay, if we have some time. First of all, thank you for such an amazing presentation. I mean, these conversations, even though it might feel like it's, stateside or far away, there are so many of these tools and systems that are somehow now, taken for granted in the way that I was wondering what your thoughts are, or if you have any sort of reflections on tools that, planners have put in place, like, land use and zoning code, and how today we sort of just take them for granted as something that is just a given, but over decades have perpetuated so much of the inequalities and injustices that Toronto now has a huge housing affordability crisis. Most of the city is zoned single family residential. Seas of it, even as close to public transit as you could get, there is this sanctity of the single family residential zoning category. Yeah. And in so many ways, it ends up as a tool perpetuating a built form that is increasing the inequalities and inequities within the city. And at the same time, eliminates or diminishes the potentials of the commons or even ideas of land trust. And somehow, even when it was conceived, it was seen that the single family residential is the sort of highest and best use. It's like what we aim to achieve, and therefore we protect it. Whereas everywhere else, where multifamilies or generational, generations were living together were seen as the sort of succession. They're still in progress. We can demolish them and put freeways because they're not as sacred as that land use. And I'm wondering, on the one hand, what are your reflections on questions like this? And then as designers, where can we, or planners or urbanists, begin to sort of break apart these taken conventions and see ways that we could completely reconceive them with the ideas of justice in mind, both social and environmental?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Appreciate that. I have a few thoughts on it. I'll start with just an anecdote about how I met Justin Garrett Moore, who was in the presentation. So both of us got called by the city of Seattle, who was interested in their public design group was interested in an equitable design sort of policy overlay, essentially, because they saw the same thing happening in Seattle as you're experiencing in Toronto, right? And they were like, well, how do we get ahead of it? And after about 2 days, we kind of went, maybe the best thing is sort of a Robin Hood strategy, where you spend a lot of time trying to defend something that you don't have any purview over in terms of private property owners. Maybe it's a matter of community benefits agreements and other tools to take the wealth created from those entities and literally transferring it to education to, helping to establish other areas. But the bad side was we didn't deal with the real crux of the problem, which was geographic. It was like actual places. A lot of innovation in that regard that I'm seeing are in legacy cities, smaller towns and rural areas that don't have these immediate sort of real estate sort of pressures. So, for example, where we are, what might be called mid-century, strip malls and sort of auto-dominated infrastructure are places that are sort of in flux right now, right? So there's been so much energy pushed into city centers, which I think from a regional perspective is probably good, but it didn't prepare for how those values were going to displace people that were already there that didn't have property ownership and control. But planning ahead for these areas that we know are going to be transforming and getting ahead of that curve. And so that's what we learned from a lot of these community land trusts. Boston's example was, was an area where there wasn't that amazing growth pressure, and communities kind of intervened and said, gave government the stiff arm and said, let us figure it out because we're agile and we're faster. Where we are in Durham, the Durham Community Land Trust, one of the oldest urban land trusts in our country, was the same situation where they kind of gravitated to an area, sort of anticipating and speculating, and in 10 or 20 years, it was going to become, it was going to get pressure from economic development. So let's get ahead of that curve and deal with that. So I think some of it from a design perspective is more regional in terms of looking at how the system is operating. In the case of legacy cities, city governments have played a really crucial role, which is to say city-owned property. I mean, city can tell you what they want to do with it. In our case, in the Southeast, laissez-faire, which is to say they're afraid of scaring off development by putting too many strictures on land. So we're kind of a bad region to look at. But in other more progressive parts of our country, be it, form public housing sites, police headquarters, hospitals that reach the end of their life, old school facilities, other things. It's amazing when you look at a map and see how much cities own. And they're feeling that pressure as well. Like, so from, their constituents and their stakeholders are like, yo, is that the highest and best use? Given all these things, they're in a really interesting position of saying, yeah, we can accept some of this energy from reinvestment and developers, but we got some rules, right? So we need to provide affordability, we need to provide, healthcare, we need to provide educational opportunities. And so there are examples in more progressive cities where that's true. And I think that that balance of maybe forecasting and seeing areas that we think pressure is coming that have not been figured out yet, and the resources that are actually in the common ownership now as city-owned and taxed property become two places where that kind of stuff can
happen. There's a question here from Suzanne Aaron. Have you found that cooperatives have been more easily enabled to be sustainable in materials, energies, and the food production? And I had suggested this, for example, to Little Jamaica in Toronto, and I wonder about their ability to be informed by your research. So, two-part question.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Because, I put a link to the map. It's a naive first attempt by our students to start to document these, but there are many different kinds of cooperatives. So it will serve an education for us as well. So on its face, I would say yes. What we discovered was, all of them benefited from partnerships, which is to say the ones that were kind of on their own struggled a lot. And some that were documented are now defunct. So just to give you a heads up that some of them are mapped are no longer working, but there are producer cooperatives, consumer cooperatives. There are other ones that are important. There was an interesting article actually in the New York Times this past week about milk production in our country. And the largest milk producers and dairy producers in our country are a cooperative. They're a producer cooperative. So, part of it is what we found. And if you're really interested in it, I can send some other resources because we asked the students to do some analysis dealing with those particular kinds of questions of what they self-reported as the keys to their success. But what came out of it were these partnerships. And so I don't know the particulars of this particular community in Toronto, but the cooperative has to be tied to, would say, a demand, in terms of whatever they're using to build collective strength and interest. It's tied to something on the other side that provides those resources that is very valuable to them. The Boston example with Dudley Street is because it was not a rapidly growing part of town. Their political mechanisms for what to do with urban land was urban renewal related, which was large footprints that were going to be completely cleared. Like their whole Boston machine was a redevelopment authority. And so they didn't know what to do with these little small areas, kind of small vacant lot there, 1-3 blocks down, multiple ownerships. But these local communities were more agile, right? They could say, hey, we could take that on and it wouldn't, damage our capacity. We're like perfectly suited. We're a perfect match for that. So that's what I mean by sort of finding that opportunity and that connection is the cooperatives just on their own don't seem to do much, but when they are in relation to a demand or a resource, they tend to do better.
We have a question here from Michael Piper, who says, amazing presentation, thank you. I'm curious about the degrees of difficulty in creating cooperatives. Has it been easier to create them in some places as compared to others? If so, what mechanisms, policies, or conditions have enabled them?
Very good question. In our case, we were focused on the Southeast and largely with smaller communities, rural areas. And I would say there were some that were sort of arts and culture oriented, which we weren't expecting to find, that really dealt with sort of local practices and that sort of thing. But a number of them were either consumer or producer cooperatives in some sort of way. And I would say that in that case, what made it easier in some ways is in those communities, there were less layers of sort of bureaucracy and rules and policies, and they were kind of at a state where they didn't really have a viable alternative. And so there was sort of a thirst and demand to kind of fill that gap. Generally speaking, in the cases the students researched, as it started to urbanize and get denser and get bigger, there were more layers of policy and governance. There was more competition for whatever services were being provided or land that was being owned or operated. And so that required, partnerships. I would say in my hometown in Detroit, I didn't tell them to do it, but those students got an A for doing cooperative research in Detroit. One of the successes that's coming online now is a cooperative grocery store. Now that took 10 years, of advocacy and pushing, but and in many ways it's because of the perception of consumers in terms of, what's a stable sort of consumer base for a grocery store. It's shocking, getting into that stuff, like what they really look at, like education level as a predictor of spending habits, right? Even more than income, and so communities that don't have, large populations of people who have a lot of formal education are just always disadvantaged. Whereas places that may not have as much wealth, but have a lot of people with, higher levels of education get it. And Detroit is one of those places where, you just don't have that resource, unfortunately. But that being said, they did a lot of work of sort of challenging that stereotype, saying, who needs it, what the price points are, can you make a profit? And that sort of unlocked, the resources required to build that cooperative. So I think that some of it is challenge and bias, I would say, in terms of what people think people are capable of. Come back to the capabilities piece. Some of it is what's called patient capital, which I've heard a lot about now in terms of people who aren't expecting an immediate return on investment, but are willing to wait. A lot of the innovation that's happening back home in Detroit is because of that. Because investors come in and they're like, usually, I want 4 to 1, right? Every dollar I'm putting in, I want 4 back, and I need it back in like 4 or 5 years in order to make this development deal work. There's a number of other philanthropies, institutions, other groups who are like, 20 years, 30 years, maybe you don't pay it back, and that has altered in some ways the way that things are being invested in and funded. So I think that, some of it is sort of sophistication of the group and the skill sets required to sort of navigate that kind of stuff. But the successful ones all had partnerships. They weren't on their own.
I'm curious about the connection between some of your efforts with courses and the kind of the limitation of the course being 3 months, and then the duration of some of these partnerships and commitment, and the what you just spoke to, which is that some projects may take 10 years to even come to any fruition. And so how do you reconcile that? And do you advocate for a long-term sort of repeat visitation of the same project year after year in part of curriculum? And, I guess bigger question around when we think about transforming our education in landscape architecture or architecture design in general, it makes me think about bigger question about how we need to transform education and community partnerships without respect towards social justice. So maybe you can speak to some of your thoughts about that.
Sure, that's a great question. We grapple with that all the time. I have different perspectives on it. I think that more and more our students or the students who are coming here are wanting to have a social imperative, right? Like they're getting into this field to deal with gripping issues, right? So that's the expectation coming in. And then the other part of my brain, the academic part of my brain is like, it's just sort of a skill set thing. You got to find ways to help people build the skill set. So when they're in those situations, they're actually contributing. They're not harming the situation. And sometimes it's hard to do both at the same time of satisfying that need for solving or addressing a very complicated social imperative, but also building in technical skill sets. And I would say I'm 50-50 on it. Sometimes it's gone horribly, horribly wrong. But the times it's gone well are, to your point, which is a commitment that transcends studios. And what's hard is that as these community efforts morph and transform and pivot, how adaptive we can be on the academic side to respond to that. So, the short version I would say is whatever community we are partnering with and working with is just upfront to be just very clear about, what our expectations are. I think in some cases we think we're going to scare away community partners by saying, hey, this is a hypothetical kind of project. We're not trying to use you as, a test case or guinea pigs, but, these students need that kind of skill set and it would be great if they worked with you. And sometimes they tell us to get out of here and we don't want to hear it, but sometimes they're willing to participate, right? So there's an opening there that says that it doesn't always have to lead to immediate impact, and that people kind of recognize that and know that. But if they are expecting impact, it's got to be structured in a different way. And in my opinion, classes that parallel another entity, like a third party that is really sort of managing the overall arc of it, a lab, a center, a research entity, where you have people who are going to be there, right? And then, it's a matter of matching the academic experience with what's needed, from that particular level community. That's the most success that I think we've had here, is when there's been like another party sort of there, kind of, we're the ones that are going to maintain the continuity and make sure that things are moving forward, proceeding, and then we'll insert the classes where appropriate, but we're not just going to rely on the class in that time frame to resolve those complex issues.
That's great advice. Thank you. I don't know if we have one more minute for a question. I have one as well. I'm just thinking about some of your other, writings and talks that I've heard, urging a kind of a more nuanced approach to EDI, and also a kind of a colloquial definition of place and community, a relationship to place.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could speak a few words to that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I know we're up against the wall. I'll try and keep it short. Some of the writings I've done have just been asking that question of what do we really have to do to have our profession reflective of the communities that we serve. And, a major blind spot is how we've told the history and how we've dealt with theory and those kinds of things. They've been exclusive to the experiences of a very small group of people, with the assumption that, sort of a trickle down thing that sort of, it came from a certain cultural context, but let's forget that cultural context. It's universal and it's human oriented. And I actually think some of that is true, but I think there are other experiences that it's radically different in terms of how we think about the landscape, how we engage with it, how we value it, that we were missing. And since I'm Black, I kind of focused on my own cultural experience, and that's what led to sort of the Black Landscapes Matter kind of piece. So I think that as a profession, that's the important part to me, and I think so much of it is fee for service, about how we present ourselves to people who have a lot of money that will hire us and allow us to do our work. And I'm not going to diminish that. That is important. But I do think that there's a whole nother world out there of how we could think about how we present ourselves, how we think through things, how we collaborate with people with more of I would say, a cultural competency. So that when we're coming in the door, we kind of understand, or we are willing to learn how to understand how people who are different from us see the world around us and value things that we may not particularly value, and how we can kind of come together and resolve that. So that's sort of the spirit of a lot of that writing.
Thank you so much, Kofi. I mean, I think these are such incredibly rich and difficult but important conversations that our profession, I'm saying even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were not even thinking about having. So I feel like this is just even the start. It's incredible even how our own studio pedagogy evolved in the last year. These like seismic shift moments that I know are here to make us better in the long term, but has made it such a difficult and precarious moment that we're all going through, that voices like yours are so appreciated to help guide us and enlighten us in ways. So thank you so much for joining us. I just wanted to make a little quick plug in for our next event, which is this Thursday for the book launch, Terra Sorta Firma, Reclaiming the Littoral Gradient, November 18th at 6:30 p.m. and hope to see you there. Thank you again, Kofi. Thank you, Liat. Thank you for everybody for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And in Toronto next time.
Yes, in Toronto.
Right. Yeah, now we're talking.
Take care.